Tonight will consist in 4 parts. The first one is getting to know Tony and Dave. Then we'll hear Dynamically Adaptive Organization presentation. Then we will have an interactive session for comments and questions and topic after Tony and Dave's presentation. Please leave them in the chat. The second last part is going to be a quick retro, so please help us in shape this meetup group. We will use Mentimeter. And finally, we will have some Elabor8 recommendation for our community. So let's get started. Tony and Dave are both executive principal at Elabor8. Tony Pontun is Agile thought leader and co-creator of Remote Agility Framework. Devin Marin is enterprise coach and transformation specialist. They will present Dynamically Adaptive Organization speech, where we'll explore the key principles, strategies, and insights necessary to thrive in today's rapidly changing business landscape. So it's time to pass to you, Tony and Dave. So would you like to tell a little bit about yourself and the topic?
Okay, we can do that.
I think we can do that, yeah.
We can do that. You go first, Dave. Age before beauty, my friend.
Well, you win on both counts, Mr. Pontun.
Right.
So, yeah, Dave Martin, for those that don't know me, as Raf said, enterprise coach. I'm also a co-creator of Remote Agility Framework. I've been doing this for a long time now. I think, as Tony will say, it's like our 3rd decade of doing agility. I first got exposed to Agile stuff in, I think, about 2001, when the company I was working for looked at it and went, that's not for us. We shall invest in project management and PMOs and process operations groups, and that will keep us safe. And it spectacularly didn't. So I've basically been doing Agile things ever since, and sort of thinking about the future of agility and where organizations need to go.
Cool. And you heard I'm Tony Ponton, and also co-creator of the Remote Agility Framework. Much like Dave, this is my 3rd decade. I started doing Agile in 1999 in an organisation that later on became the premier Agile organisation in Australia, and have ever since been in the working with Agile, thinking about how we work with organisations and what the next step is. And today is a little bit of that, a touch point, I suppose, on our thoughts, because it is a very expansive topic, and we're not going to be able to get through the entirety of it in a short period, but hopefully we can give you a touch and a taste of it. That helps. I'll share. Can you just let me know that you can see that okay?
All good.
All
Loud and clear.
Beautiful. Don't need our heads now. Dave, feel free.
All right. So that the whole kind of gets to the whole point of agility and why the whole agility thing came around. It's a quote from our old friend Mr. W. Edwards Deming. It is not necessary to change. Survival is not mandatory. If you go back a bit further, Charles Darwin said in the Origin of Species, it is not the most intelligent of species that survive, nor the strongest. It is those that are most adaptable to change. If you want to survive, you need to be able to change. And that's really what at the heart of agility. Forget your scrums, forget your safes, forget all of that. The heart of agility is being able to adapt and change as conditions change. And we know that conditions are changing all the time. There's this thing called VUCA, which we've all heard of: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That basically describes the business environment that we're in at the moment. Let's be honest, we've always been in. Things are always volatile. Market conditions change, customer expectations change. They're changing more rapidly now than they've ever changed before. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty around at the moment. What are the markets doing? What's the economy doing? What are governments doing? What's happening in Ukraine and the Middle East? All that sort of stuff is adding a great deal of uncertainty. Complexity. The world is getting more and more complex. We're building systems that are increasingly complex and hard to understand and manage. And that's making everything very ambiguous. So particularly for leaders, dealing with that level of ambiguity is really, really tough, because we're hardwired to be certainty seekers. And that's very difficult to do in an environment where ambiguity is everywhere. There is no certainty in ambiguity. So the idea is to flip VUCA into VUCA 2.0, which is having a vision, having understanding, having clarity, and having agility to respond as things change.
So there's lots of these different versions of these things around where Agile came from. But Dave and I thought we'd just take a step back in history before we go a step forward, because we're talking about dynamically adaptive organisations. And we just wanted to sort of premise that. And we were asked a little bit when we were asked to do this talk to talk a little bit about what we've seen in change, right? Because basically when we say it's our third decade, it's just our way of saying we're old, right?
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
Literally 1970s, there were traditional methods. It's worth mentioning in there, as Dave was saying, before that, there were things like the OODA loop methods, etc. So, agility was always around, but traditional methods in the 70s was really stock standard waterfall.
We lost a lot of agility, or what we would now call agility, coming out of sort of the Second World War. Mr. Deming essentially invented his system of profound knowledge back in the 1940s. And a lot of that is very agile or very lean in its thinking. But a lot of that got lost during the economic booms of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when that sort of thing just didn't matter anymore. Everyone had a job. Everyone was making heaps of money. It didn't really matter whether we were doing it effectively or not.
They proceeded to profoundly ignore it.
They did. They ignored Mr. Deming's system of profound knowledge.
But in the 1990s, so I don't know if a lot of people know this, and I guess I have the benefit of spending a lot of time with a couple of the manifesto people. Have had the opportunity to pick their brains on how things happened. But in the 1990s, there was lightweight adaptive programming. So the precursor to agility, if you like. And if you like, even pre that, there was the new product game which Scrum based itself on. And don't ask me to say the name of the people that created that thing, because I can never remember them. I'm terrible. And at the same time, lean TPS was hitting its straps as well, although it had been around since the early periods as well. So you think about lightweight adaptive programming, they knew things weren't working. And the signatories of the manifesto and a number of people were coming up with these different ways of doing what they were doing. And so they all had their different variants of it. Now, I'm not sure if you've all seen all of these or you know of these, but the reason we want to bring those to the table is because they're the precursor to what we see today and where we're going today, right? Crystal was Coburn's, XP was Kent Beck's, Scrum was, of course, Schwaber and Sutherland, DSDM was Archie Van Buren. So you can see those. Of course, as we've gone through the mists of time and grown, things like RAD and the original UP were unified process, which then became rational unified. They bought it, which then has morphed.
Scarred many of us deeply.
Which has morphed into SAFe now, right? So, and feature-driven development has sort of faded away, but you find the attributes of feature-driven development, feature, epic story, how you write stories. They all created the agility landscape that we live in today. And of course, if you're here, you all know that in 2001, there was the Agile Manifesto for Software Delivery, where a group of them got together and said, we've got all these things, let's do something about making sure that they're all under the same umbrella. We'll think about how we're going. At the same time, non-manufacturing lean was kicking off, so don't ever forget that was kicking off at the same time. And of course, that changed the way that we did Agile, or we did software delivery by using Agile. And when I was doing this in 2001, we were using extreme programming, where we morphed that into Scrum, and we had a lot of success. However, to span the organizational gap, we needed then to add to that stable. And I guess that's where we're at today, if you think about it, right? So there are many Agile methods today. You have business agility, you have scaling, Kanban, Scrum, right? And there's a plethora of them. In fact, if any of you see my good friend Craig Smith's talk, he does a 40 Agile methods in 40 minutes. And his joke is always, if you gave him 60 minutes, he could do 60 more, right? So the reality is there's a very large set of those out there today. But the reality of it is, and not to denigrate any of those methods, the organizations across the world that are actually outstripping and moving forward and surviving and thriving have gone the next step. They're not just taking Agile and adapting it. So we hear a lot about adaptive Agile or adaptive organizations. That's great, and not to say that that's not a good step in it, but the reality is dynamically adaptive organizations harness agility and much more. And that's what we're talking about today. So I'll step through to the next one and let Dave talk about what dynamically adaptive actually is.
A dynamically adaptive organisation is an organisation that is both dynamic and adaptive.
Thank you for that, Dave. That's very, very clear.
Yeah. So by dynamically, we basically mean it's able to respond and react, react to the situation that it finds itself in. And this is what a lot of organisations just can't do that. I was talking to the C level of a bank a few years ago and asked them, look, if a competitor came out with a killer product that was going to eat one of your business units alive, how long would it be before you could have something in market to respond? And they ummed and they ahed and they thought about it for a bit. And they said, well, if everything came together and we got all of our ducks in a row and everything which went absolutely right through the process, we could maybe have something to market in somewhere between 24 and 36 months, which is not going to save you. If you've ever seen disruption in an industry, it happens really, really quickly. So if you want to survive, being able to respond dynamically to the situation is really, really important. Of course, the other bit is that adaptive piece. So adapting to the situation as it comes up, not just having a plan and sticking to it, but changing in response to changing circumstances. So as the customer's needs change, as the market's needs change, as your internal needs change as an organization, you need to be able to adapt and change to that in a dynamic way in order to survive. Does that help, Tony?
That helps a lot.
So Lisa Adkins says this really, really well. We're in a huge shift all over the world from the conception of organizations as machines. And this is a really common view of organizations. We have processes and they chug along like clockwork and they spit product out the end, sort of in a sort of manufacturing way. We're moving away from that to the dawning realization that organizations are complex like ecosystems and rainforests. So if you want to change a machine, the way you change it is you tear it to pieces and you rebuild it. If you want to renew a rainforest, you don't burn all the trees down and sort of start again. You let the system adapt. And this is what we're seeing in organizations at the moment. They're stuck in this mechanical view where every year or two let's do the big reorg, and they tear the thing down and they rebuild the machine and everything's terrible for a while until it sort of manages to kick itself back into gear, rather than having this continual cycle of renewal and growth like you see in an ecosystem. And that's really what we're getting at with dynamically adaptive, is this idea that an organization needs to continuously adapt and grow, not by tearing it to pieces and rebuilding it. What's the zero-based design? You hear a lot of things, which basically means we're going to start the organization from scratch and build everything new, and everyone has to reapply for their jobs. That's not the way you renew a complex system.
You cannot restructure a redundancy your way to success. So that means we have to change the way we work. And when we talk about dynamically adaptive organizations, they're the ones that are better equipped to actually weather those storms of disruption, right? And when we say they're increasingly common, I'm probably understating it, disruption is king ever since COVID came to visit our door, and it's only increasing. Unfortunately, we have wars, we have climate change, we have all of those effects, we have inflation. So disruption, not just in terms of disruption in the market, but disruption in the ecosystem that we actually work and live in. And so, those organizations that build that culture of adaptability, as Dave said, become more resilient. And that's what we talk about, building resilience, so they can navigate the change and they can ensure, that their survival, they can survive and thrive in the long term. And so when we talk about that, we've sort of distilled that into a set of elements for dynamically adaptive organisations. But I do like to caveat in this is at the time of presenting this, even at the time that I wrote the original white paper for this, is that because it's dynamic and it's changing as we go, there will be more attributes to add to this as we go. So the first thing that we see is value-led teaming models. And I'm not going to dig too deep into these because we're actually going to dig a little bit deeper into them. But thinking about how our organisations are value-led and what are the operating and teaming models that enable that. Deliberately developmental cultures. How do we enable our people for change? Adaptive leadership, because if we actually have organisations that are dynamically changing, then we have to adapt our leadership style. And of course, adaptive governance. And let me premise that by saying when we talk about governance, that's how we govern the system of work in its entirety, not just your PMOs and your projects. So we'll talk about that a little bit in more depth. So what we're going to do is we're going to dig into each of these a little bit. They're very expansive topics in each of their own right. But again, we said we hope we can give you enough touch and taste, and obviously we're happy to answer questions when we get towards the end there. Dave.
Yeah, so value-led operating and teaming model. So the way an organisation is, we've all seen this kind of slide. Organisations tend to be aligned around it with functional silos, technical silos, business units, something like that. What they're not organised around is delivery of value to customers. So if you want to build a new product, you need some people from IT and some people from product and some people from legal and some, from people from all over the organisation. And in traditional structures, the only way you can do that and bring those people together is in this thing called a project, which is why we see most organisations, everything is a project, because it's the only way to bring these disparate groups together in some sort of temporary construct in order to deliver value to customers. We all know this. It's a really inefficient way of doing it. The way we want organisations to operate is to align themselves around value. So rather than have your IT department and your legal department and your business and all of those come together around some sort of construct that delivers value, whether that's customer journeys or value streams or something that's aligned to delivery of value. So rather than have that delivery of value being a temporary thing that comes together in projects, it becomes the way the organisation arranges itself. So it optimises itself for delivery of value rather than for essentially the convenience of management. It's much easier to manage all the developers as one group, so let's put them all underneath one manager. What we need to do is break that out and start to manage the delivery of value rather than the busyness of people. I think that's probably the key there. It's rather than keeping people busy, it's keeping value flowing.
So alongside that is adaptive governance. And as I said, I'll just premise that again so that it's very clear. When I'm talking governance or governing, I'm talking in terms of the fact that we're governing the system of work as whole. We are governing from the steering to the enabling and enhancing to the making levels of the organisation, both horizontally and vertically. We're not just talking about PMOs and project management because they're only a small part to the model. So I'm going to borrow a bit of a quote here, and I don't know if Phil's online, but Phil and myself, shameless plug, have written a book about soon called Govern Agility, but I do like...
Available at all good bookshops.
Or in the bargain bin, I assume. And I'm not going to read that out in total because everyone who's on here can read, I assume, right? So the tagline or the single thing that I press against that is that what we're talking about is actually putting Agile in your governance, not governance in your Agile. You're enabling your organisation to be nimble and be adaptive. And the dynamically adaptive organisations do that by leveraging the use of governing the systems that are adaptive to match the dynamic environment. They deliberately design and they regularly inspect and adjust their governing mechanisms. And I think that's a real key factor there in order to, systematically address how the work is funded, how they facilitate the information flow, in order to create that transparency and trust. And it's also about ensuring the knowledge is not, bifurcated. Bifurcated means that at the steering level, they know a lot. By the time it gets to the making level, they know a little, and in the middle knows pretty much a bit of both either, right? So it's ensuring alignment and rapid decision making. So, I talk about that. In order to do that, there's some key factors, right? There's decision making is decentralized, it's autonomous, it's closer to where the work gets done. So we talk about that being close in person, place, and time. It leverages that thought of intent-based leadership and enabling people to make those decisions. Your demand management in these organizations is based on continuous value flow. So we talked about value-led, right? We have to have values flow that's supported by prioritization. It's decentralized. It's in very short cycles. So when we talk short cycles, the organizations in industries that have backed themselves into a corner now using quarterly planning or big room planning, that's not fast enough anymore. By the time you've set a quarterly plan, I'm going to ask a rhetorical question of those that are on here who've been involved in these big room plannings and program increments, etc. By the time they put that plan in place, how many times do you get back and start the work and that plan is null and void because things have changed, priorities have changed, capacity wasn't available? So these organizations plan in short cycles, short wave planning, and they're very adaptive and they have very clear guide rails to enable people to make those decisions. And we used to go with guide rails, right? Not guardrails, because guardrails box people in, channel them that way. The guide rails are there to guide them in the decisioning, the prioritization, and the escalation. And it's very clear. And all of this is really, it's supported by decentralized adaptive planning, right? Short wave adaptive planning and that dual information flow, top up, bottom down, horizontally. And for my good friends who love this term, collaborative connective tissues of the organization that allows the information to flow horizontally and vertically throughout the organization to allow people to make directional decisions. And so we make the directional decisions based on that, we're then able to actually deliver. And you can't do that without looking at funding. So dynamically adaptive organizations look at the three layers. They don't just look at the flow of work, which is what most organizations transition. They look at the governing systems in terms of your portfolio, but they also look at the funding. And funding is incremental or it's team-based capacity funding. And lastly, add into that to allow that information flow, it's real-time or short-wave progress reporting. So that's really where we're headed if you're thinking about agile or adaptive governance in a dynamically adaptive organization. And that's a big change when you think of where our traditional organizations sit, or even if you think about organizations that are in partly the agile frame or they're starting to think about business agility. That leads us to adaptive leadership, because you're going to need adaptive leadership with all the things I've just talked about, but Dave's going to talk so you don't have to listen.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know when we're talking about things like aligning to value and governance and so on, a lot of people can look at this and go, oh, we do this in Agile already. And absolutely, yes, we do at some level. So even like, really big, complex, like SAFe or less type rollout of, big scale agility thing will typically be operating at like the portfolio of work level. It's still very much in the delivery space. So we've gotten quite good at optimizing these things in delivery, but not so much at optimizing these things anywhere else in the organization. So, if I steal some of Tony's thunder around governance, how does an organization do strategy? So part of governing the system is setting the direction of the system, and that's strategy. So how does an organization do dynamic strategy? Most organizations have a strategic plan that was written by a consultancy firm 5 years ago, and they've not really looked at it since. Or they've got a strategy department that goes off and does strategy in isolation and then hands it to everyone and goes, this is our strategy. And everyone looks at it and goes, that'll never work. So how do you become, as an organization, like dynamic about the way you do your strategic planning, about your funding? It's all the things that, funding's the big bugbear. We've always hit that wall of going, oh, now we've got to talk to finance and try and convince them about funding teams. And that's where we tend to hit a brick wall, because we've not had the language to talk to these other parts of the organization because agility is seen as, oh, that's for the developers, or that's for the delivery part of the organization. We don't need to worry about that stuff. So yes, we absolutely do a lot of this stuff within agility, but this is also looking at how do we apply this to the rest of the organization. And one of the ways we do that, to get myself back on topic, is through adaptive leadership. Leaders need to adapt. Like, how often do we see leaders say, I'll go do this thing to my teams, but leave my reports alone? I want to see my old status reports. I want my old steer codes, but go do agile things in my teams. Leaders need to adapt and change as well. One of the models we use for this is the SEAM model, which is put together a few years ago by a good friend of ours, Esther Derby. She talks about 3 domains within the organization. There's the making domain, which is the detail of the work that gets done. There's the enhancing and the enabling domain, which is looking at capability and looking at process improvement, and it's enhancing and enabling the way that the organization delivers. And then there's the steering domain. So that's the direction setting, growth targets, future planning, that sort of thing. What we see all the time is that leaders get stuck down in the making domain. So you've got very senior leaders within the organization who are entirely consumed by the detail of doing work. So they're in all the steer codes, they're in all the planning meetings and all of those sort of things. They're involved deeply in the making of work, and that basically forces the whole organization to focus only on that making domain. Nothing gets done about enhancing, enabling. Nothing gets done about steering. So I was working in a large organization that shall remain nameless to protect the guilty. There was a piece of work we were trying to get done. It was 2 weeks of work for one developer, and it took 6.5 months to get itself through the system. In that 6.5 months, there were 13 steerco meetings, and at every one of those steerco meetings, they looked at where the requests were, which group they were sitting with, whether they could expedite the request by a day or 2, and they really got into the detail of trying to make this thing fit through the system. Not once did anybody ask, why does it take 6.5 months to do 2 weeks worth of work, which is an enhancing and enabling question. So the whole organization was trapped in this making domain, and it meant that nothing could change, nothing could improve. And that's something that we see all the time in organizations.
So then we talk about deliberately developmental, and it's a fairly challenging topic, because what we hear, and I've been doing Agile a long time, as you know, and I've always heard we need to change the mindset or the growth mindset or etc. But there's never a bit about how. Oh, we'll implement Scrum, or Agile will give us the growth mindset. Well, I'm here to tell you it won't, and I've seen it many, many times in organizations. That's even exacerbated when you think about now that we have organizations moving at speed. We talked about the VUCA. Dave talked about extrinsic VUCA, the VUCA outside of the organization. But the imprint of that is that you actually have intrinsic or internal VUCA caused by the external VUCA, which means your organization is going to change. And so if you think about that, the ability to respond to change is an organization's competitive advantage. The thing being around that is that organizations are not static things. We need to embrace that, because for far too long, we've been looking at organizations as static. Your business and market conditions will change, and that will put the pressure internally to ensure that you need to change. Technology will change. And I don't think you need me to quote things like ChatGPT and etc. to know how fast technology is moving. But the speed of technology actually changes what's happening within your organizational constructs as well. So if all of that is happening, the piece that gets left behind is organizations need to actually enable their people to dynamically adapt to change. And to do that, they have to deliberately develop people. They have to be deliberately developmental, because if you think of all the things that are coming at people, I touched on some of them, right? There'll be new ideas. There'll be new future staff capability they'll need to cope with the new technologies and the new changes. They're going to be, the operating models are going to be dynamic. We know that operating models are going to change. How many times have you seen your organisations ripped up, pulled down, put back together? Well, if that's going to change, to quote Heidi Hefner, then you need to do it in a formulaic way. You need to embrace it and do it well. But part of that is deliberately developmental change for your people. So their expectations will change. And as I said, the technology platforms will change. So what does that all mean to you? Well, that means that, often organisations, as Dave said, have a mission, they have a strategy. But what they don't have is a deliberately developmental North Star or strategy. So it's thinking about how we are going to help our people embrace change. How are we going to create developmental practices that enable them to embrace change? And to do that, you need to map the terrain, you need to understand what's coming, and you need to be able to adapt to that quite quickly. But if you don't do that, then your organisation will fall. And there's a great quote that I like to use, and it came from Jack Welch, so it's not new. Right? And his favourite saying, or one of his favourite sayings amongst them, was, if the rate of change on the outside of your organisation is bigger than the change on the inside of your organisation, then you're losing. And the only way that you can enable that is to enable your people to understand how to change and embrace change. Dave?
I should throw in, there is another famous quote from Jack Welch, which was the best way to get happy employees is to fire the unhappy ones every year.
I didn't say everything he said was.
Yeah. What we're talking about here is the stuff that is like fundamental changes to the way that organizations operate. And a lot of the time, we're really, really bad at doing change to organizations. There's a lot we can learn from the education sector in this. There's a thing that they've got called the zone of proximal learning, or the zone of proximal change. Yes, the beatings will continue until morale improves, as Anthony said in the chat. Essentially, when you're educating children in schools, that there's things that they can already do and things that they can never do. No matter how much support you give them, they can't do them yet because they just don't have the foundational skills. But there's a layer between can do and can't do, which is can do with support. And that's where you start to build new skills. And as you build new skills, you start to build the foundations that allow you to build more new skills. This is why we don't teach, particle physics in kindergarten, because the kindergartners just don't have the foundational skills and knowledge to be able to deal with that. What you do is you teach, basic science and basic maths, and then start to build on that, always keeping them in the can-do with support. Now, what we see in a lot of organizations is either the change is so small that it's sitting in the can-do already bucket. Like I've seen large organizations go, all of our teams are going agile. Every team shall have a stand-up at least once a week. And everyone patted themselves on the back because they'd done a stand-up once a week that took 2 hours and wasn't very useful, but that was in the can-do. It didn't change a single thing. Or you see these things, we're going to become an entirely agile organization within 6 months, or these really ambitious change programs that fail because it's in that can't do space. It's too big of a jump for the organization. So one of the things as practitioners we need to be doing is guiding the organization on what they can already do, and therefore that's not learning for them. What's a bridge too far that they're just going to fail at? But what can they do with support to learn the new skills they need to do in order to grow into where they want to be? So that vision of the fully agile company, it's a great vision, but it's not a one-step process. You can't just flick the switch and do it. You might need 3 or 4 different steps, always keeping them in this can-do with support zone in order to help the organization grow and learn. And this is really kind of the heart of dynamically adaptive organizations, is they never stick in the can-do box. They never step into the can't-do box. They always keep themselves in that can-do with support box. And they keep themselves learning and growing forever as they need to.
Now, the last thing I'll say to finish this up is that please don't go away thinking that Dave and I are saying that Agile is dead or Agile doesn't have a place. But what we are saying is that dynamically adaptive organizations embrace agility in certain facets, but that's not going to get you everything that you want. Creating an Agile organization might not make you dynamically adaptive, just make you good at Agile. What you need to do is think about the other attributes that make the organization able to build resilience and be adaptive.
Yeah. A lot of, I know I made the mistake, when I first started out, that, it was like, hey, Scrum is good. In order to make an organization better, you just got to Scrum harder. So let's do Scrum at the C level. Let's do Scrum at the board level, and that's not the right model for those sorts of groups. So agility is absolutely the foundation of everything here, but it's about adopting other tools and techniques from other places, things like beyond budgeting, which is an awesome way of getting finance people on board. Taking all of those tools, Agile, Lean, all of this stuff, and building it into a thing that becomes a dynamically adaptive organization. And every dynamically adaptive organization is going to be different. The model that works for organization X will absolutely not work for organization Y because they're in different contexts. So it's not like, the Spotify model that you just pick up and move. You need to build this thing in the context of the organization.
Was that the Spotify model that's not really a model, that wasn't ever a model, that shouldn't have been used as a model?
Yes, that's the one, yeah.
Just on that one. That's it.
I put the scare quotes around it.
And anybody who wants to challenge me on it, I know people who work there. I'm happy to plug you, and you'll find that they haven't
That's right.
in a very long time. Anyway,
we can introduce you to Heinrich.
Anyway, continue on. I guess from that point on, we're charged with just answering your questions for about the next 10 minutes. Would that be right, host? Right.
Yes. Thanks, guys. Yeah, time for Q&A. I have a question for you. Because I'm the host, I'm gonna choose the questions, and it's gonna be my question.
With great power comes great responsibility, Raf. Don't abuse it.
I want to just understand from you. So in the last few years, let's say, we are talking about dynamically adaptive organization. But a few years ago, we were talking about business agility. Now, my question is, where is business agility sitting in the dynamically adaptive organization?
It's a piece of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the problems with business agility is it's still, a lot of it's very much in the Agile language, and that Agile language is known and understood by a lot of people in the delivery part of the organization, but it's absolutely rejected by people outside of there. So if you talk to somebody, in the C-suite about velocity and all these Agile concepts, they're just either not going to understand or they're not going to care. So business agility, I think, it's a good step. It's about trying to bring the business on board with this delivery thing, but it hangs itself up a lot on the language generally. And we heard a lot about it a few years ago. We don't hear so much about it anymore because it's not. Well, it wasn't really able to bridge that gap. At least I don't think it's been able to.
Yeah, and as I said in the first part of the talk, which was sort of blown under the radar a tad, is that dynamically adaptive organisations they embrace things like business agility. They embrace all of the things that we have, but they embrace more.
Yeah,
and that's the reality. So it's not business agility. We're certainly not sitting here to try and denigrate any of those kind of things. It's saying that they take those on, but you need more than that to succeed in this environment.
Cool, thanks. Let's go now with the question of the others. So there is Maris, I think. So he's writing, is the habit of standardizing processes and practices that we inherit from established factory management practice at the root of loss of agility and taste for experimentation? is that part of what impairs our organization ability to adapt?
Oh, I have to say yes and no to that question. What do you reckon, Tony?
Yeah, again, it's a one of those yes and no depends questions, isn't it?
Yeah. Look, standardization is important in some areas. Like you need to be able to standardize the way information flows through an organization. You know, the CEO doesn't want to get 15 different formats of report from different business units. It needs to be the same thing so he can understand what's going on. So there's places where organizations need to standardize or need to harmonize what they're doing, but there's also places where organizations need to be able to adapt dynamically to what's going on within the teams. And I think where it becomes a problem is this drive of organizations to standardize everything. And that's where it starts to break.
And not only is it standardization, but they try to normalize it. So when I talk to organizations about transformation, true transformation, not transition. So I premise that transitional transitions where they're just looking at the flow of work, when they're trying to transform across the length and the breadth. That means they're touching all of the facets that we talked about. Standardization is necessary in certain instances, as Dave said. So are we using the same language? Are we sprinting in the same cycles? Because how the hell do you actually have a flow cycle if you're not standardizing those kind of things, right? But normalization is not something that we want to use, which is what they bundle under standardization, right? And that's been the advent of some very large consultancies who have propagated the fact that that team there has to have the same velocity as that team there because that team's a better team because they got more velocity. They haven't thought about it in terms of what that team's doing. Across the organizational construct, they try to normalize things, estimation, et cetera, right? So as David said, it's really the fact that you standardize what is necessarily needed, not every single thing in the organization, because otherwise you won't be able to adapt. I hope that answers it.
Yeah. Thanks. I have another question from Nancy. When you have a leadership team, what says, do agile to my teams, but leaves us alone? What would it be first things you would do with a, can I read here? Such a leadership team to get them to see the light?
The beatings will continue. No, yeah, it's a challenge. Some leadership teams, all you can really do is just go and do agile at the team level and show them that it works and hope that it grows. Some leadership teams, though, if you talk to them in the right way and in the right language, they'll understand that they're part of the problem as well, and they need to change the way that they operate in order to enable their teams to operate in a different way. But it's, look, I will come to because there's a few comments about sort of leaders there and being stuck in the 60s and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. Leaders, I'm going to defend leaders a little bit, only a little bit.
He always does it.
I know. I used to be one. Leaders often feel very, very stuck. So most leaders have come through an operational role. So they become a leader because they're really, really good at doing something operational. And suddenly now they're not an operational person anymore. They're a leader. But what's the one thing that organizations almost never teach their leaders? That's leadership. I've been on more leadership courses than I can count. 99% of them are management courses. It's about how you do your performance reviews and how you do your performance management and all of that sort of, how the leave systems work. It's not about how do you lead people. So most of the time, leaders are basically having to make it up as they go. They also feel very, very constrained. So, you talk to teams, go, oh, if only I was the leader, I could have some room to move. You talk to those leaders, they say, oh, if only I was the executive director, I'd have some room to move. You talk to the executive directors and go, oh, if only I was the CEO, I'd have room to move. And the funny thing was, I was in a whole room of CEOs a little while ago, and some of them were saying to me, oh, if only I had the room to be able to make change because I'm answerable to the board and to the shareholders. So everybody feels highly constrained, which is why a lot of leadership is hard to change. But if you engage them in the right way, they can start to see a path forward. A lot of it's not that they don't know that they need to or that they don't want to, it's they don't know how.
I would add to what David's, I agree with where Dave's coming from, but I would also add that as an Agile community, as I've seen it evolve over the 30 odd years, we haven't done ourselves any favors.
No.
We use a lot of terminology. We tell them what they have to be. We tell them how they have to be. We tell them that we're going to do things like safe to fail. Please don't ever use that to a leader. That'll make them run. Tell a leader in a bank that you're going to safe to fail. No.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things have not been useful to any of them. That's why, to be honest with you, I started using dynamically adaptive organisations because the Agile word has been damaged by organisations saying you must be an Agile leader, but not lead, as Dave said, teaching them how to lead in that kind of environment, enabling them to understand the difference. Like if you go in and you put Scrum into a whole bunch of teams and you haven't taught that leader what they now need to expect, where they get their reports, how they understand how things are happening, agility by rote, when you actually put it in an organisation, disseminates control. If you do not teach leaders to understand how to deal with that, then they only have one other leader and lever to pull, and that's command. And that's when you will hear leaders saying, you must, you have to, you will, you need to, and pulling them back to the way that they understand it. So yeah. I know that's a big rant from me, but I'm very passionate about that.
And you're absolutely right. Look, as a community, we have kind of sucked at talking to leaders. We go up to senior leaders and we talk to them about things like team velocities, and they go, I don't understand it and I don't care. It's learning the language to talk to them about return on investment and strategy and direction and capability and all of the concerns that they have. We need to speak their language in order to communicate that with them. I could rant at length on this, or at longer length on this.
But we'll defer to our host because we know we're time pressure.
I'll pick last questions. Organization is sufficient structure to be stable enough to survive. Does that mean that the organization need to consider intellectual capital and learning as valuable assets?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of our organizations aren't doing that, right? The churn and burn they put their organization through. So, you look at it like I went to an organization that I'd been in once before, and every shred of everything that had been done in terms of agility had disappeared. That valuable IP, that human capital, all of those kind of things hadn't been retained. And that is exceptionally the secret sauce to an organization. It's not the safe guides, the Scrum guides, the Kanban guides, the less guides. I'm not picking on any, but it's not those things. It's those things that you have designed that in the context of how it works within your organizational construct.
Yeah, Danella Meadows is one of the founders of systems thinking, talks about respecting or honouring the wisdom in the system. And we don't tend to honour the wisdom in the system, or organisations don't. Every organisation has somewhere on its website, our people are our greatest asset, but almost no organisation actually treats them like that. The intellectual capital of the people is absolutely the greatest asset of the organisation, but we see all too often it's reorganised, it's restructured, it's offshored, it's gotten rid of in many, many ways. They sort of try to substitute, knowledge management systems. So let's try and type everything into Confluence to capture it all before we outsource the team. It just doesn't work. It's that wisdom of the system that needs to persist.